welcome to those watching on YouTube to a short speedrun episode. This one is actually going to be short. It's pretty late in the day. I want to play some 5-minute chess today. Pretty tired, so let's keep the tempo up and hopefully I can make it short and sweet. And my goal is to make every episode worth your while, whether it's long or short. And I'm going to adhere to that today as well. Now we're nearing 1800 in our Blitz speedrun component. This speedrun has been a mixture of 10-minute chess and 5-minute chess, and obviously because I get more 5-minute games in per capita, our rating is much higher, and hopefully you're kind of enjoying the different time controls and the fact that the fact that we're two different ratings means that we're facing different levels of opposition, and I'm trying to make it interesting for everybody. So we're facing this F4 variation. Apparently, it's called the McDonnell Attack. I actually never knew that. I've always thought of it as sort of an inferior Grand Prix Attack. And those of you who've watched previous speedruns should know that the reason Grand Prix players start with knight c3 is precisely because black has this very powerful response, which is to play d5 and now not to recapture with the queen. That defeats the whole purpose, but instead to play positional chess with knight f6, offering this pawn as a sacrifice. And I'll do a quick review of the theoretical basics of this line after the game. Now, this check I'm actually not too familiar with, but I'm going to play intuitively here. I'm going to cover with the bishop. It seems logical to develop. The trade of bishops is typically in black's favor because, and we're going to recapture with the queen, in order to provoke white into pushing c4. Instead, white plays knight c3, so we can just recapture the pawn. And I'll tackle some of the reasoning behind my last few moves after the game. Knight to f3. I want to say that we might have had this kind of position in a previous speedrun. And in a sort of classical game or a longer form game, I might spend some time trying to calculate the move knight takes f4. But instinctively, I don't like it because it opens up the f file. We're lagging behind in development, and why would you risk the entire game for a measly pawn like that? Let's just go knight c6. It's important to play this move before e6 because we don't want to let white's knight jump into e5. Now we have two modes of development. We can play g6, but since our priority is fast development, e6 I think is a more efficient move and it's a more stable move because it creates this nice kind of bulwark on the light squares, which is going to make it hard for white to push f5. Okay. And knight e5. Now, we don't have to take on e5. I mean, technically we can move our queen, but I don't see a good reason why we would dodge this trade. And now let's simply complete our development with short castles. I think black has a slight advantage here. So what are the targets that we can target in this position? So there's two things that I notice. Three things. First of all, white has not completed their development. This bishop is still on its initial square. The obvious target, I think, is the e5 pawn. It's an isolated weak pawn that's also blockaded, so it's pretty easy to attack. But it's very important in these situations not to tunnel vision your opponent's major weakness because you're not going to win the game by playing a move like queen c7. Okay, that's a pretty dumb move because it also just blunders a pawn. But white has the resources necessary to protect this e5 pawn. What you need to do oftentimes is to combine play on various sides of the board. And that way you kind of overstretch your opponent's defenses very quickly and more effectively attack kind of the main weakness. So what I notice after queen f3 is that the c2 pawn is unprotected. And a very typical resource involves jumping to b4. This is a kind of idea that I can show you applications of in many openings. Where suddenly this pawn is hard to defend. So white defends it. And now we have a pretty appetizing choice. But I think that we should play pretty aggressively here. Many ways that we can prosecute our initiative. But let's make the positional move knight back to c6. Now we're going to use our knight to hit this pawn. And potentially we're going to reroute this knight. We did a little ring around the rosy. But before we do that, I'm noticing a tactical pattern, which is that the rook and the king are aligned. So if we were to get our bishop to this diagonal, good things would ensue. So let's start by playing c4. And d takes c4, bishop c5 is bad. White plays rook d1, but that doesn't actually stop us from playing bishop c5. Maybe white is relying on the move bishop to e3, but this is where you have to keep an eye on your opponent's main weakness. And this is why this mythical term pressure is so important in chess. When you apply pressure, the benefits extend far beyond simply being able to win whatever pawn or piece you're pressuring. You're creating strain on your opponent's position. So eventually, by creating other threats, your opponent's quickly going to get super overextended. This blunders a pawn with tempo, but it actually blunders more than a pawn. Now we take the bishop, forcing the queen to recapture, and this hapless rook on f2 has been the subject of several tactical operations, culminating in a fork. We win the exchange, and the conversion should be pretty easy. Straightforward chess, take the rook. No need to reinvent the wheel here, take the pawn. Now, given that white's king is quite a bit more exposed than ours, I would not be inclined to play queen c6, which is probably what most of you would have played. I actually would put the queen on c7. And maybe some of you are worried about like a rook coming to h3, but white does not have nearly enough resources to make anything happen on the king side if you remain vigilant. Which is not to say also that you don't want to simplify intelligently. If we can swap a pair of rooks, that's going to make the winning process a lot easier, but keeping queens on the board ensures that we actually can be the ones who quickly initiate a decisive mating operation against white's king. So rook a to d8. Now white can't really turn down the rook trade because our rook would infiltrate to d2. And now, again, simple, straightforward chess. Trade, bring the other rook to an open file. And if a convenient opportunity arises to trade queens, then you should do it. So you should really kind of evaluate how the game is going. And you should never treat one of the winning methods as a dogma, right? I've talked about this a lot, how there are, like, broadly speaking, two ways of converting a material advantage. The classic method is just to trade off a bunch of pieces. And I'm really talking about situations, let's say, where you're up in exchange or above, like exchange, up a minor piece. The second method is to use that extra piece and generate a strong attack against your opponent's king. But in practice, you're basically combining these two methods. You can start out trying to initiate an attack, but if a good opportunity arises to trade queens, you shouldn't turn that down just because you've chosen a strategy. Okay, here obviously the knight is hanging. Let's capture it. Notice that I'm taking a couple seconds, just making sure that because our back rank is weak, you always need to be very vigilant. It's very easy to forget that things can turn around in an instant. GG. Okay, so a pretty simple game on the surface, but in reality, there was a lot more there than met the eye. First of all, there was some theory to talk about. So, e4, c5, f4. Again, if you've been watching the speedruns in sequence, then you should actually have amassed a good amount of theoretical knowledge by now, and the move d5 should be essentially automatic to you. We've had this position many times over the last few speedruns, and we faced mainly e takes d5, but of course e5 is also a move that you should know, which basically leads to like a dream Caro-Kann setup for black, because you're able to take control of some of these key light squares on the king side. And if white plays e5, then I would recommend starting with knight c6 and basically waiting for white to put their cards on the table. Like the moment white plays knight f3, you have the additional option of bringing the bishop out to g4. A lot of people, they start with the move bishop f5, and this is a little bit hasty because oftentimes playing bishop to g4 and just getting rid of this bishop eliminates the headache that you might have down the road. So like if white goes h3, you can grab this knight, and actually in this position, you can already apply massive pressure with the seemingly artificial move knight d4, which may not seem to do anything after the queen retreats. You're like, well, what's the point? White's just going to chase this knight away. Who can tell me a very simple but incredibly powerful idea by black? Like, what should black do here? And it suddenly turns out that white is in like a lot of concrete trouble. Yeah, just e6. And amazingly, like if white plays c3, white gets checkmated in 2 moves. This is not a mate that you're likely to come across in any other position. So after e6, white has to make another dreadfully weakening move. I think white has to go here. Ugh. The computer actually gives the move g5. Just bang, cracking through this incredibly brittle pawn structure. There's one game in the database here from 2023, c3. And now simply knight drops back to c6. By the way, very important move. If instead you play knight f5, you allow this super nasty check on b5. You always have to be vigilant as to your opponent's ideas. And white's pawn structure on the king side is completely crumbling. Totally crumbling. You're going to go GF, and the queen's going to drive on out to H4. This is horrible. G5, what a move. So I won't delve into E5. What I want to focus on is after ED knight F6, in previous speedruns we faced C4, and now the idea is to positionally sacrifice a pawn, and in return, you should kind of either know or understand intuitively why black has very powerful compensation. We've had a couple games that went like this, but bishop E5 check is actually the main move. And here, what I'm seeing is that both NBD7 and bishop D7 are entirely possible and quite good for black. So bishop D7 is indeed very good. Takes, takes. And now white played knight C3, which is not a testing move. White simply gives back the pawn, and clearly black is slightly better because now this pawn sticks out like a sore thumb. So knight C3 is, I wouldn't call it like a big mistake, but it hands over the advantage to black. The only way for white to at least fight for something is to play C4 here. And after E6, there is a move that looks very nasty, which is queen to E2. And why does queen E2 appear to be rather unpleasant for black? Who can explain? And it's kind of instructive sometimes to try to understand not just your ideas, but your opponent's ideas as well, because it builds sort of more robust knowledge of the position. So why is this move more unpleasant with the bishops off the board than it is here, for example? Why not queen E2 here? Well, E6 is just as pinned in this position. But what's the difference with the bishops off the board? See, it's not so simple. Nobody said that. There's a very specific answer to this question. Yeah, so the basic idea is that after white plays D takes E6, either, let's say the black plays bishop D6, either we will be forced to take back with the queen, which will trigger an exchange of queens, which theoretically should be bad for us because we're down a pawn, or we have to recapture with a pawn, leading to a weak backward pawn on E6. But it turns out that our development advantage, combined with the fact that white has this incredibly weak pawn on F4, supersedes, and of course, the D4 square, which is a very big potential outpost. All of that is much more important than just one additional weak pawn. And if white tries to capitalize with F5, we actually can just continue developing and completely ignore the threat. F takes C6, just slide the queen in front of the pawn. Now we threaten to jump in with the knight, and we're just going to continue developing. And eventually what's going to happen is, okay, white's going to castle. We're going to bring the rook into the game. Actually, no, here black wins with knight to G4. Wow, incredible. White can resign. Incredible. H3. And now, oh, this is sick. Okay, I will admit this is like some computer lines. This position actually has occurred 3 times in classical chess, 1998. And the best move is knight to D4. Okay, so you're hitting the queen, white has to take. And now you will not believe the response. Black to play. And this is almost a trick question, because the correct move is what like a 600 would play. If they looked at it, no offense to the 600 watching, I love everyone equally. But like a beginner would play this move almost automatically. No, I would say C takes D4, recapturing the knight. Right? Most advanced players would start calculating the check or looking at knight H2, or maybe I should trade the rooks first. The correct move is just to play CD. The basic point is, first of all, if white takes the knight with a pawn, then queen H4 sets up overwhelming mate threats against the king. So white's going to take with the queen. And here we trade on F1, and we play the incredibly calm prophylactic move D3, just burying this bishop and slicing off white's ability to involve any of these pieces in the defensive effort. Then we just pre-move rook F8, and the king is going to get hunted down summarily with some beautiful lines, absolutely beautiful lines, or not. So king E1, we just go queen F6, unstoppable threat, and now we can do something like this. And if white goes king to G1, then the best move is queen to C7. And the point is, look at this mate, check mate, using every inch of the chessboard. So white has to play queen to d1, covering the f1 square. Now another check, and now we reverse the battery. This is what I find really lovely. Queen to g1, and a final deflection, rook f1, and queen h2 is mate. Whew. Yeah, don't tell Kramnik about this. So I've gone kind of deep here, but what I wanted to illustrate is that oftentimes you have to weigh the factors, right? A single weak pawn is not going to make like a massive difference. Black has many, many sources of compensation. And the final note I'll make here is queen takes c6. Same thing. I mean, you just get a huge lead in development. And even with the queens off the board, white's king is going to get hunted down. And I mean, just look at this position. You still can go knight g4. And after h3, black wins with knight h2. Another lovely tactic. Because of the simple deflection, you win the rook on f1, etc. But the sort of undergirding factor here is the fact that white has not developed a single piece on the queen side. And you cannot survive for very long with half the board on its initial square. Okay, so instead white played knight c3. All of that will remain behind the scenes. And the next stage of the game was pretty straightforward. Maybe some of you are wondering why. I don't even want to look at knight takes f4. This is something you could look at on your own, but I can guarantee you this is not a very good move. Some of you may be wondering, why didn't I play knight takes c3? And the reason is this structure is actually a lot better than it looks. It's like a car bumper. It's not pretty, but these pawns control a lot of important squares, particularly the d4 square, which became very important later in the game. And again, if you've been watching the speedrun, you should know that in the Gleck system, which I'm recommending from white's perspective, you get this structure very often. Like you actually get it in the main line. And it's a very robust pawn structure, whether the pawn gets to d3 or advances to d4. So that's why I kept attention, developed my pieces. And the most important moment was here. The moment the queen moved away from d1, I jumped into b4. The knight rerouted to c6, hitting the pawn. And then tactical awareness helped me find the move c4, just completely shattering white's position. Even if white had remained alert to the threat of bishop c5 and played something like king h1, I would have taken on d3. And now white's center starts to crumble. The knight is getting into the center. This position is borderline strategically lost for white. Of course, white had better ways to defend, but the hard work has already been done. In the game, white tunnel visioned the threat on the pawn and forgot, I think, that now the e5 pawn falls with tempo. So a lot of tactics here, but the root causes of white's loss was positional. That pawn on f4 being weak, and then the pawn on c2 and the pawn on e5. White just created too many weaknesses, and I used tactics to exploit it. Any questions before we jump into one more game? Okay, one more game. Let's do another 5-minute game with the white pieces this time, e4, and let's see if we can get a Gleck system. Finally. No, still no Gleck system. Unbelievable. I am shocked at the amount of people who are deviating from the 4 knights. At least we didn't get a Philidor this time. Now, we have faced this before. And if you've been watching and taking notes, then your response should be largely automatic. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with playing g3 here. But the problem with trying to play the Gleck against this setup was, first of all, you have a much better move. And second of all, the knight can come out to e7. And then black can quickly orchestrate a plan with f7, f5. So a lot of you are probably yelling out knight takes e5, the center fork trick. It works like a charm in this position. And it immediately gives us a nice advantage with best play. If black does not respond properly, either black can go knight f6 and transpose into the Stafford Gambit. That's a pretty funny transposition. This is a very common move at the club player level. And we have faced this before as well. We go d4. And black is, it's not an exaggeration to say that in practical terms, black is close to lost here. Now, I'm pretty sure we're following an older speedrun game. And a lot of people, when they kind of first encounter this type of position, they might think that it's unclear. Like, okay, you might see that you have a big center and you have the bishop pair, but, the king is very weak and it's not clear where we should go. So you might think that these factors balance each other out. But in fact, the weakness of the king is a complete illusion. The white king is perfectly safe because black lacks both the firepower to exploit it, like a dark squared bishop would be amazing for black, but it's gone. And eventually, it's only a matter of time before we kind of coordinate our pieces on the king side. Right now, it may seem very awkward that the king is on g1, and we would much prefer the rook to be on the other side of the king. But this is a temporary solvable problem, while the gains that we have made are permanent. And we might not even need the rook on h1 to start a devastating initiative in the center. Okay, so now that I've kind of laid the groundwork, there's a lot of ways in which we can prosecute this initiative. But there's no need for us to rush. Like knight d5 is probably the choice of a lot of people watching this. Knight d5, queen to d8. And a knight on d5 can actually backfire if it's not supported properly, because black will simply develop their own knight to f6 or e7, and we don't want early trades. Let's just go bishop e3 and focus on healthy development. Knight d5 is not going anywhere, actually. In fact, even now, I think it's a much more effective move than on the previous move. Yeah, now I think knight d5 is irresistibly strong. Let's do it. Forcing the queen back. Okay, queen d6 is just a losing move. I mean, black is playing terribly. Yeah, just bishop f4. This should be pretty straightforward. And we win c7. We win the rook. We win the game. Just like that. Yeah, queen d6 is odd. Queen to g6. Okay, now what's funny is that even if we don't take on c7 on this move, we could take on the next move. But in that time, black would be able to slide away the king and ensure that that move didn't come with a fork. So here it's a time-sensitive matter. We got to take the rook while we can. Ooh, queen takes e4, resigns. Now, one immediate mental note that I make to myself is watch out for checkmates on this diagonal. Like queen e3 would be mate if we weren't protecting that square. What is the kind of most effective technical way of dealing with this temporary problem? Some of you might be tempted by a check on c7. And if you were adhering to the strategy of trading pieces, bishop c7 is excellent, because you could follow it up with queen to e1 or queen to e2, forcing the queens off the board. Alternatively, the big boy method, if you wanted to go for checkmate, is to play this seemingly kind of vanilla move, queen to d2. Now, black can play queen takes d4 and initiate the trade themselves. But yeah, knight takes d4 falls right into my designs. Now you can use the same idea, but instead of trading queens, you use it to win the queen. Of course, we're now going to bring the rook to e1. You can do it immediately, but it's more forcing to do it with the check on c7, forcing the king onto the e file, and then bringing the rook into skewer position. That's it. 14 moves. But the game was already decided as far back as like move 8. And now it's forced mate, bishop d6. Knight has to block. We take, and we mate on one of 3 squares on the 8th rank. Black resigns. GG. Again, opening knowledge is what helped me win this game efficiently. Definitely we have faced this move before, and I think more than once. The quote-unquote main line is for black, of course, to play knight takes e5, d4, and now black has to know the move bishop to d6 in order to preserve the bishop pair. Now we play de bishop takes e5, and does anybody remember what move I recommend in this position for white? It's actually, if you don't know this move, it can be pretty unintuitive to develop in this way. What should white do here? Let's see who can recall, because we have had this position before. So far, nobody has said the move. So what a lot of people think when they see this position is, of course, f4. The issue with f4 is that it's extremely premature. And you're like, well, why is it premature? We're forcing the bishop off of the center. We're grabbing space. Like, what could possibly be wrong with this move? Well, the problem with f4 is that after the trade, there's a couple of issues that immediately arise. The first is that this bishop on c1 is now unable to jump over the pawn. Now, why is that important? Because in a scenario like this, the move that we would just kill to be able to play is bishop to g5. This is a very important resource, and this pin can be incredibly nasty. But also, the move f4, when you play it before you castle, just creates a bunch of weaknesses on the king side. Your position's going to be very flimsy here. The second move that people always say is bishop c4. Also wrong. This move is wrong because after knight f6, you're going to have problems with your e4 pawn. Now you might say, well, I can castle, and black can't take this pawn immediately. I mean, this is very ill-advised because of something like queen d5. But black is also going to castle, and now black actually is threatening to take on c3 and take on e4. And it's actually not so easy to protect this pawn in a kind of robust, safe manner, which is why the correct move, it's not queen to d5. Here I can simply defend the bishop with d6, and your queen is going to be a sitting duck, and it's going to just help black develop the king side. The correct move is bishop to d3, which is, and you should pause here. If this move was not on your radar, you should ask yourself, well, why was I not attracted to this move? Well, the likelihood is because what is the bishop doing just staring at the pawn? But this is the concept of potential energy, which I've talked about in previous speedruns, where sometimes a piece is developed to a square, either for like purely defensive purposes or because later in the game, it's going to pay dividends. Like it has a very specific job. Where does that job come into play? Let's say black plays knight f6, white castles, and black plays the move d6. Now white to play and make an incredibly powerful move, after which black is immediately in trouble. And this move shows the genius of bringing the bishop out to d3. Does anybody remember, or can anybody figure out this brilliant move? I have also shown this before. It's knight to e2. Again, it's not f4. Actually, this time f4 is not that great because black has this check on g4. And why are you allowing this to happen? Unnecessary. The move is knight to e2. Finally, you're threatening to play f4. And the bishop on d3 is such an important piece because it protects the e4 pawn. Black has no good way to stop the threat of f4. The only serious attempt is d5. But after f4, black actually loses by force. Bishop has to drop back. Now you play e5. Bishop c5 check, king h1, knight e4. Looks double-edged, but in fact, after the move f5, white is just able to steamroll black on the king side and in the center. For example, let's say black castles. Here, well, the computer gives this very cold-blooded move, knight to g3, just trading off the knights. These pawns are an absolute monstrosity in the middle game. Now, you can analyze this on your own. I don't want to get too much into the weeds. But this is an important line to know because you're going to face this. So just remember bishop d3. And of course, if black preemptively takes on c3 and says, well, I'm not going to let that happen, now we see why we were delaying the move f4. Now you can actually bring the bishop to g5 and only then play f4. And black simply has no good answer to the threat of e5 because anytime the queen moves, you take on f6. All these subtleties, they're learnable, but this is why I advocate for opening study pretty early on. Black played bishop takes f2 and knight takes c5, which is a very common mistake, overestimating the kind of the factor of white's king, which is actually perfectly safe. And it should kind of make sense to you given the course of the game. Black has no development, no ability to exploit the temporary weakness of the king. And he goes down very, very quickly. Now, a6 is a kind of nonsense move. If I would have found myself in this position as black, I would have done everything possible to develop as quickly as possible. So probably d6 or knight ge7 should have been preferred. But this position is still absolutely miserable. Like for example, you can play bishop c4. And now we can simply get the other rook into the game with rook f1. Black's position sucks. Absolutely sucks. Queen to g6, for instance. And now we can engineer a little rook lift with rook f3, rook g3. The bishop's coming in. If black survives for another 10 moves, it would be a miracle. Some people are saying, no, but knight g4. Knight g4. Oh, knight g4 is a devilish little move. No, this, thank you for alerting me of this. I didn't see knight g4 at all. You cannot take because of this classic mate that I've highlighted, that I highlighted during the game. Here, white gets checkmated. Here, actually, you have to be very accurate. But by process of elimination, white literally only has one move that doesn't lose. Literally. Because black is threatening these two things. The only way to defend both is queen to d2. And black's quote-unquote initiative fizzles out immediately. Because on the next move, you're just going to go h3 and kick the knight away. The knight is going to be forced back to the super awkward square. And now you could jump in with knight to b5. Black has no good way of protecting the c7 pawn. Queen b6 happened a few times, and you can just pile on the pressure with queen to c3, opening up the bishop, hitting c7, and trying to induce this miserable position. And you can handle it from here. So don't be afraid of these pseudo-active moves, right? These moves that look scary, they're based on a trick, but the reality is black can't win the game with 2 pieces against an entire army in the opening. Any other questions? Other than that, I think pretty straightforward. Bishop e3 is a move I would pay attention to if I were you. We did not just blindly jump in with these kinds of moves because here black just deflects the threats. So threats for threats' sake is not always effective strategy. You have to understand what the larger game plan is. And that's that. Oh, somebody was asking what was our plan after queen to d8. Here I was planning to play queen g4 and hitting g7 and trying to provoke more weaknesses on the king side. But, you know, this is the kind of position I would set up if I were you and spend 5-10 minutes analyzing with a computer. You know, see if you can understand how white should develop the initiative. Do it right now. Like, pause the video, set this up on chess.com/analysis, input the moves, spend 5-10 minutes, just like, you know, free form analysis. Make some moves for black, see how the computer attacks with white. And that's an easy and underrated way of learning about certain types of positions. I can't spoon feed you everything. I'm going to try. All right. One last game, guys, and then we'll conclude the episode for tonight. Let's go e4. And we get a chance to play another fantasy variation. Takes e. Okay, knight f6. Already a mistake. And a mistake that we have faced and punished several times before, but in previous speedruns. Black is kind of playing based on general principles, but allowing us to claim a larger chunk of the center with e5. And when you look at this position, it might kind of remind you of an Alekhine. For those who don't know, an Alekhine is e4, knight f6, e5, knight d5, or an Alapin, where these same moves are played after the inclusion of c5, c3. You might be like, well, what difference does it really make that black has a pawn on c6? Well, a huge difference, because first of all, the f file is now open. So we have a very clear game plan of quickly developing our king side and then just jumping into g5 with our knight, which, as primitive as it looks, can win us the game in just a couple of moves. The second thing is that the pawn on c6 really slows down the development of black's queen side. So while a lot of you might be tempted to go c4, this move is not necessary because we're not trying to steamroll black in the center. The knight on d5 does not bother us in any way. Let's instead focus on rapid kingside development, starting with knight f3. Now let's be smart about it. Because we want to be able to move this knight, I think it's a good idea to develop the bishop to e2. Now we castle. Now black can take on f3 preemptively. Great, that gives us the bishop pair. And we're keeping the move c4 in our pocket. We're going to play this move, but we're going to do it at the right moment. And I think that the moment is now. So I would like to develop my queen side. To do that, I mean, the best way to do that is to play knight c3. But allowing a trade is just not something that I feel is necessary. So I think now is a great time to kick away black's knight and develop our own knight to c3. Now, what pathway can you immediately spot if you think about this from an outpost point of view? Anytime these c6 and e6 moves are combined, what square do you have to keep an eagle eye on in terms of the ideal square for the knight? It is the d6 square. Yeah, so we don't just play knight c3 to develop, we're also setting up this potential maneuver. But there's still no need to hurry, and we still have one piece to develop. And one potential problem that I'm sensing is that if we direct our attention to the king side, we might have some issues with the d4 pawn, particularly if our queen slides away to e1, which is a very typical maneuver that you should be familiar with, queen e1, queen g3. The pawn on d4 is going to be a weak spot. So let's add another defender. I think this is going to serve us well down the line. Now there's many ways that we can handle our attack. We can play the move knight e4. That looks like a great move. Or we can initiate kind of the more straightforward maneuver queen e1, queen g3 with the aim of involving the queen and kicking this bishop away from g4. There's lots of moves here. Knight d2 I also like, actually. That's a very classy move as well. Let's start with knight e4, keeping our options open and just centralizing the knight. Queen e1 is probably coming next. It really depends on what black... Okay, b5. Trying to fight for the d5 square. I mean, it's a pretty decent move, but I think we can just go b3. Okay, a5. So what black is doing on the queen side is clearly going to be way too slow. I think we can just proceed with our own game plan on the king side, queen e1. Like, even if black plays a4, what does that even really do? Okay, thank you for helping our queen get to g3. And now the attack is over before it begins. That's the thing. But you still have to be accurate in these types of situations if you want to win quickly. So, many ways to win here. Many, many ways to win. But it's harder than it looks, I think. If you just randomly make tempting tactical moves, you're going to run into some trouble. So there's two candidate moves. Knight f6 check is perhaps the move that a lot of you are screaming for, but it's not the move that I'm going to play. The move I'm going to play is the more straightforward bishop takes h6. Okay, g6 is incredibly cooperative and honestly kind of sad. Bishop g6 was by far the more resilient move, and that will have to be analyzed by us after the game. Obviously, here we go knight f6, and the final element to the attack is just getting the queen to the h-file and setting up clearly unstoppable threats against black's king. Yeah, resigns. Kind of anticlimactic, but again, opening knowledge, even at a very basic level, is still winning us games directly out of the opening, because knight f6 is just really bad. Black's position is horrible after e5. It's almost lost according to the computer. In order to play this successfully, black has to know the move e5. We faced this countless times in the speedrun, and I've talked a lot about the theory here after knight f3. So the fantasy is a line that I heartily recommend, but you can't play it willy-nilly. If you want to play the fantasy, you have to learn a lot of theory. If you want to play something less theoretical against the Caro-Kann, I've recommended a few other lines, like nothing wrong with just playing the exchange with bishop d3. This you can play just with some basic knowledge. But if you want to fight for the advantage, it's worth learning a lot of Caro-Kann theory. So knight f3, and here black has to be ultra well prepared not to lose out of the opening. Like e takes d4 is a very common mistake at the lower level, and just one of many lines that illustrates the dangers that black faces is after bishop c4. I've had a lot of games at like my level that go precisely this way. Knight f6, castle's short. And the uninitiated player usually goes bishop c5 here, which is a losing move. And it loses because we jump into g5 with our knight. Now, the point is this check is not dangerous. It doesn't do anything. So most of the time, black castles thinking that everything is all right. And now white has a lovely winning combination, which I've shown before, but a while ago. Who actually knows the winning procedure here for white? And it's not what you might think. Actually, you need to be super accurate in terms of your first move. The key difference is that after knight f7, black can move the queen. And there is simply no good discovered check. There's no way to win anything with your knight. Bishop f7 is extremely strong because black basically has to take. If black moves the king aside, now you play e5. And the story is very different here because you just win with queen h5, h6. Now a classic pattern, queen to g6. Threatening mate, forcing hg, now step back with mate. You should be familiar with this pattern from like Puzzle Rush. So black has to take on f7. And now comes the cherry on top. Knight takes f7, king takes f7. And e5, of course, is winning. But even more powerful is, out of nowhere, queen h5 check. Obviously, knight is pinned, and we win the bishop on c5. And a good time to note down for yourself the importance of lateral attacks in general. They're very easy to miss, like a queen attacking a minor piece. But attacking it laterally is a super common source of blunders. Where else do we see that? Well, one very common type of blunder is in an opening called the Cambridge Springs variation of the Slav, where black plays queen to a5. White's main response is knight to d2. After d takes c4, a lot of people just sort of automatically play knight takes c4, forgetting that the bishop is actually hanging. Another weird trap that comes to mind in an opening called the Naroditsky Attack, Black has this weird trap where they play, let me try to remember. It's like, how does this go? I think it's h6, bishop f4, bishop h4, c6, e3, queen b6, queen c1. And here Black has this move e5. Like, oh, Black's sacking a pawn for activity. Let's take it. No, that's not, Black is not sacking a pawn because of this fork. Very unconventional fork because the bishop is actually on h4. And the bishop is lost. So just a good idea to keep those two sides of the board connected in your mind. And again, if you're playing the fantasy, you got to learn some theory. In the game, we immediately got like an overwhelming position after knight f3. And everything was very straightforward. I don't really think that a lot of variations are necessary. c4 was a big moment, timing this correctly. Knight to c3. One very important detail, when you have this particular structure, you have to make sure that Black can't poke away at it with c5. And here we simply have the response d5, but that's not always the case. So whenever you have a big chunk of the center, make sure that you have these types of moves accounted for, because they can be very, very unpleasant. They can cause your center to crumble really, really quickly. That's actually part of the reason I played bishop e3 is now c5. Apart from d5, we can also just take the pawn. And then we can get a knight to d6, and that's a monster square. But that was not necessary. Knight e4, b3. And just the one thing I want to point out, of course, again, Black could have defended more resiliently, but that's kind of beside the point. What would I have done in response to bishop to g6? So here, actually, there are many, many ways to win the game. Many ways. I'm just looking with a computer to see what the simplest one was. If you want to play like a Russian schoolboy, if you want to avoid any complications, your choice should be just dropping the bishop back to g5. And you should always remember that, like, when you have an overwhelming attack, oftentimes there's going to be a sacrificial way to win using tactics, and there's going to be like a simple move that keeps your material advantage intact. Black is probably going to go back to e7. You're just going to take, and you can win this game without sacrificing a single piece. Knight g5, queen h4, bring the rooks into the game, etc. If you want to be fancy, you can play knight f6 check here. gf6, ef6, opening up the e5 square for the other knight. And there's just way too many threats here. And Black's pieces are way too passive. Queen can come to h4, bishop to g7, and queen h8. And just look at this. This is not even something you have to really calculate, just because of the amount of pieces in the attack. So also a good position to explore if you want to learn more about proper ways of attacking. But clearly, with Black's entire queenside sectioned away, this was not a hard attack to conduct. And that's where we'll end. Another successful fantasy variation. Next speedrun, we'll play more 10-minute chess. Apologize for the short episode, but it's pretty late. And I want to get some rest. Hope you enjoyed, folks. Thank you for watching. And thanks again for everybody who supports my YouTube channel and clicks that subscribe button. It helps me keep churning out the content. All right, guys, I'll get going. Thanks for watching. And that's that. See you guys later. Thanks for hanging out. Bye.